The last video was getting a little long, so I thought I'd separate cancer out and talk about it just in its own little video so that you have smaller chunks to watch. Cancer, you remember from Baby Bio, is a disease of cell division. You get unregulated cell growth, and that's what tumors are. Okay, so when all those checkpoints and factors and things like that that are acting on cells to try to keep the cell cycle, regulated, so that the rate at which cells die is equally timed with the rate at which cells are growing and dividing, so that you keep the same number of cells in an organ or in a tissue or whatever. That's all carefully regulated chemically by cells. But when cells stop responding to those cues, we call them cancer. So some cancerous cells tend to divide continuously and spread easily, while others stop at a checkpoint and just don't go any further. The other problem is that cancers tend to signal. Remember, we talked about in cell signaling, how cancers do autocrine signaling. They send growth hormones that they receive on their own receptors that cause the cell to keep maturing or to keep growing or to divide uncontrollably. And those growth factors can actually be picked up by neighboring cells. In other words, that cells can kind of send chemical signals to neighboring cells and recruit them to become cancerous too. And that's how cancers tend to spread. Cells that are benign, when you have abnormal cells in a cluster, they're benign if they just don't change. They may stay in a particular state for a while. And then they become malignant when those cells start changing neighboring cells, recruiting neighboring cells, and then invade and start to impair the function of the organ that they're in. And then, of course, sometimes those cancerous cells will break off and end up in the bloodstream, and that's called metastasis. So the cancer can actually metastasize that way. There are some pretty cool NIH animations that you can watch about how this process works. I think they're really good explanations to get kind of a fundamental understanding of how cancers work. All right, so here's a benign tumor. All right, they might continue to divide, but they're not really spreading. They're not really recruiting these neighboring cells, right? There's the benign tumor. Here's a malignant tumor. Here you see a lot of cell division, and now these cells are starting to invade outside areas and recruit other cells to become cancerous. And then, of course, here we see that some of the cells are entering the bloodstream, traveling to new organs, and starting to become cancerous there. That's metastasis. All right, so why do cells become cancer, right? Why do they stop responding to the cues that they're supposed to respond to like normal cells do? Pretty much everything is genetic, right? And inside of your body, because genes are producing the proteins that your cells use, and because proteins do pretty much everything inside of your cells, scientists think that mistakes in genes are what the problem is. Sometimes you're born with those mistakes in those genes, and sometimes you accumulate them over the course of your life. A gene that causes cancer is referred to as an oncogene. Onco refers to cancer, so an oncologist is a cancer doctor, okay? So sometimes you're born with those genes, and then sometimes what happens is other genes that regulate the cell cycle accumulate mutations and become oncogenes. And there are two categories of these genes. Proto-oncogenes are genes that actually code for proteins that regulate the cell cycle and promote cell cycle, right? Now, proto refers to the fact that they are not cancerous genes yet, but have the potential to become cancerous genes. Because if something happens in one of these genes then and you get a mutation that starts to mess with the function of that particular gene, what tends to happen is it triggers the cell to go into uncontrollable growth, right? So when you accumulate enough mutations in a proto-oncogene to where it no longer functions in a regulatory way, that's when we call it an oncogene. Okay. The other category of genes is the tumor suppressor gene. The tumor suppressor is actually supposed to limit cell division. It's going to inhibit. So while the proto-oncogene is saying, come on, let's divide, the tumor suppressor is saying, just wait a minute. We're not quite there yet. Let's slow down, right? So you get the activity of these two genes kind of counteracting one another to keep the cell cycle regulated and going the way that it should, okay? So those are the two categories of genes. And in fact, some of the most famous genes that we know of that accumulate mutations and cause cancer are tumor suppressor genes. So the BRCA genes, for example, that are associated with breast cancer are tumor suppressor genes. And they're genes that we all have, but if they become mutated, again, they lose their ability to put the brakes on cell division. All right, so proto-oncogenes can become oncogenes from DNA movement within a genome, right? So something moves genes around. Oftentimes viruses can do this. One of the reasons why, for example, HPV can cause cervical cancer and cancers in other organs as well, is because the virus inserts its DNA into the host cell chromosome. And if it inserts its DNA into the middle of a proto-oncogene, it can seriously mess with the ability of that gene to function, right? And that's how viruses can even be connected here. You can also get mutations in the genes, point mutations in the genes, where you get the sequence of letters messed up, either because there's a mistake in replication, or there's some sort of environmental factor, some carcinogen that changes the order of the letters in the DNA molecule, the bases. And you can also get amplification of the effects of a proto-oncogene. Okay, so the proto-oncogene starts to outpace the activity of the tumor suppressor gene. All right, so a cancer requires that you have not one mutation, but multiple mutations. Okay, so, one mutation does not a cancer make. You have to have multiple mutations in at least one oncogene. Okay, they usually begin as benign polyps or tumors, but the longer that they exist, remember, every time a cell goes through cell division, it replicates its DNA. And every time you replicate your DNA, there's a certain number of mistakes that are made. And we know that there's a mistake rate. We call that the mutation rate. Just from normal cell activity, just the fact that you've copied your DNA, and your DNA is a copy of a copy, and then it's a copy of a copy of a copy, and then it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and so on. And every time you add another copy, you get more mutations that accumulate. So there is that. And like I said, sometimes you can have mutations accumulating from environmental factors, carcinogens that build up and mess with the DNA. Both of those are very good reasons why cancers tend to be an older person's disease, but not always, obviously. There are certainly cancers that younger people can get. And when younger people get them, the cancers tend to be particularly aggressive in a young person's body. But, I am certainly at more risk for a cancer than you are, simply because I've lived longer. My DNA has been copying itself a lot longer than your DNA. And I've been exposed to more environmental carcinogens than you have, just because I've lived longer than you. And then I talked to you about viruses, right, that play a role in the development of cancers. Some viruses called retroviruses, and we'll get into the biology of those later on, but they can actually donate oncogenes. Gee, thanks, virus. Thanks for the donation, right? So they can actually insert an oncogene into the host cell. And if, like I said, if the viral DNA is inserted into the middle of one of these regulatory genes, it can certainly wreak havoc and cause the development of oncogenes. As I mentioned, obviously, cancer develops, but sometimes you actually have a genetic predisposition, because instead of developing mutations over time, you inherit a mutation from a family member. So it follows that some cancers do tend to run in families. So there are certain cancers, if you go to the doctor or you get over a certain age, and they will ask you, about your family's history, and they will say specifically, did anybody in your immediate family develop any of these cancers prior to the age of 50? Because they figure if a cancer develops prior to the age of 50, you probably have a genetic predisposition in your family. If the cancer developed after the age of 50, probably it's just from living that you've accumulated mutations or that person had, and that's where the cancer came from. And it's unlikely that there's a genetic connection for other family members. So colorectal cancer, breast cancer, those are both highly heritable cancers. In breast cancer, there are two kind of famous genes, the BRCA genes that I mentioned, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And they appear to be responsible for most breast cancers and also some ovarian cancers. BRCA genes, like I mentioned, we all have the BRCA gene. It's about having a specific genetic mutation that you inherit in that gene. Okay, so when we say, do you have the BRCA gene? Everybody's got the BRCA gene. Everybody, all of us. Men, you got it too. Okay, everybody's got these BRCA genes, but it's a question of whether or not there's a mutation in one of those BRCA genes. But these genes try to repair, they code for proteins that repair cellular damage, and so it makes sense if those proteins aren't able to function because the mutation makes them useless, then you can't repair cell damage, and those cells can become cancerous then. It also makes sense that avoiding mutagens would lower the risk of cancer, even if you have one of these mutations already in your genome. So one of the things, that they tell people when you test, you can do a genetic test to see if you have the BRCA mutations. And one of the things, you get to decide what you do with that information. If you find that you have the mutations and you're concerned and you want to have breast tissue or ovaries removed as a result, you can do that. That's an option to you. And some people decide not to do that right away, but instead to maybe change diet, right? There's certainly some connection between diet and cancer, obesity and cancer, things like that, but also mutagens, right? So doing things like staying away from cigarette smoke, avoiding using hormonal birth control because that certainly is connected to breast cancers, things like that. Those things can lower that person's risk of getting the cancer, even though they have the genetic predisposition toward getting that cancer.